I want to kind of just frame the context here that like, just in terms of where our humanity is at today, right? Like, it's kind of golden hour for Earth. And golden hour is that concept that, if you get injured, right? There's this little window of time, if you get care quickly, that you'll be okay, right? The doctors can come and treat you, and you'll be taken care of, right? And similarly, it's kind of that's kind of where we are, with our planet, from what I understand. And so I start to think about all the choices we have, right? And I have this picture hanging in my house around what do we choose? When you come to a rich community here like Grass Valley, you go into the co-op and you see just all the diversity and all the richness of this community, right? And you can see what this community is choosing, right? They're choosing life and nourishment and all this diversity. And you start to think about just the difference between this big kind of production scale and then this sort of hand, nourishment, just real just having that real relationship with the earth, right? They're just very different. Not that one's better than the other, but we have a choice, right? But then at the same time, it's when you go to the supermarket and you choose what to buy, you don't see all that in those products and services, right? Or the products that you buy, right? It's they're kind of competing on a different level, right? So our economic system is kind of perhaps out of sync, right? We do have, we have all these labels, right? We have all these things to kind of distinguish, oh, that's organic, and that's a certification body. And then we have things like CSAs and buy fresh, buy local, right? To kind of draw our attention and help us recognize the value that's in those products. They're different, right? And one thing I want to point out with these, certification bodies, right? They're centralized, right? It's a centralized system, right? So it's those, does anyone here have to certify their farm or has gone through a certification process? Maybe just show a hand.
I have to certify a business for forest sustainable fruit.
Yeah, how was the certification process? Was it easy?
It's long and arduous.
It's long and arduous.
I was able to get into the technical. I'm a printer, and this is for using their label on paper products. So it's a chain of custody thing where they have to come and look at the shop and certify that we're okay, we won't get their products mixed up. But there's a lot of paperwork to fill out.
Yeah, there's a lot to you have to comply.
Yes.
Right? And is it a creative process? I guess that's a
in fact that you have to be creative to find all the stuff. But
you have to be creative to kind of find the joy in that sort of system, right?
Yeah. I would like to be able to use the best product possible.
Absolutely. And it's important, right? Because then people can recognize that you're different, right? They can differentiate your product and so, people choose to it's certainly important, right? But yet, when you start to think about how this is just what I want to show here is, this is, 570 million farms in 161 countries, and you can see the kind of distribution of where the farms are in the world on one side. And over here you have the size of the farms in the world, right? And I just want to point out 72% of farms in the world, and this is from 2015, so that's a little, 2016, not a little out of date, but are less than 1 hectare, right? And that's most of the world is, smallholder farms, right? And so when you think about these centralized bodies, these centralized systems, it's a huge lift for them to go and get us, to where, I guess I want to take one thing I didn't mention was agriculture has an immense, potential to regenerate life or regenerate the soil, sequester carbon, support biodiversity, right? It can either be extractive or regenerative. Coming back to this kind of idea of centralization, right? Those centralization bodies, right, have a big job to do to kind of help shift practices, but it's still this sort of compliance, sort of like, we've decided that this is what organic means. We've decided this is what biodynamic means, right? It's sort of like somebody's telling you what to do, essentially, right? When you look at like things like CSA or buy fresh, buy local, there's a lot more flexibility, right? When you come to your own home community and you know who grew that food, or you know have that relationship with somebody, and you know they're a good person, and you know that they take care of their livestock or their farm, right? You don't need that big certification body. Sometimes you say, well, okay, they use a little, maybe they don't have that certification because it's a big lift. There's a lot of paperwork, et cetera. It's expensive, but I know that's a good person. Our kids are in the same school, whatever it may be, right? So there's this kind of idea of like decentralized, right? That like you can, that a community can sort of approve and say like, this is good for our community. And it's very context specific, right? So like a sort of like one of these centralized certification bodies try to create like an umbrella and say, we're gonna apply this entire system to everybody. Whereas in a decentralized model, we have a lot more freedom and choice. And perhaps the people who live in these different communities will have a little more innovation and kind of share their practices with one another. And arguably, that's what's been done with all these different cultural practices all around the world, right? That diversity is super important because that breeds innovation. We don't want to live in a world of like monocrop or monoculture, right? And so it helps support things like this, right? This is where I was earlier today, just in downtown. And it was nice. The gumball machine was broken, and somebody came and fixed it, and it was like, we want this in our life, So that brings me to Regen Network. So Regen Network is building new tools, right? Not telling people what to do. Let's let the practices kind of evolve and let people adopt and choose the practices that they want, that they think are important. And so one of the fundamental tools is what we call an ecological state protocol. Okay, it's very simple. On this slide, it's very simple. There's some kind of data that goes in, some information, and then it's like yes or no. It's true or false, kind of like a computer. You can start to think about this in terms of a landscape, though, right? An entire landscape, right? At the kind of like larger scale. You could say, here's the initial state. This was like some strip mine or something, right? And it's degraded. But there's this potential for the land, right? There's this potential for a regenerated state. And so you could apply a series of protocols to the land and kind of check, like, is it true? Is there a riparian zone on that river? Is the water quality up to a certain level? Whatever those people who are in charge or responsible for the land have decided, right? So this idea of this ecological state protocol is like a fundamental tool. Here's kind of like another way to think about it. Like you could have multiple of these ecological state protocols. You have these sort of science algorithms, right, that are like above ground biomass. How much biodiversity is there? Land conservation, plant types, Ellenberg indicator values. I'm not sure, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know all of the stuff on here. Net primary production, erosion, phosphorus runoff. Now you can start to get really interesting types of data, right, that you can collect. And you can also apply things like remote sensing, which is very passive, right? You can just put in the boundaries of your farm and see what a satellite can tell you about the land, what's changed over the past few years, right? And so you can combine all of this into these ecological state protocols and create this like rich ecosystem of protocols that are very context specific, right? So you could have ones created here in this community, right? Or along the gold, the gold rush, not gold rush, the gold, what is it called? The gold, Gold country, yes, thank you. I lost the word. That applies to all the gold country, right? And you could borrow from others. So these are some examples of like potential like ecological state protocols that could be developed, right? And these are like, science organizations could help develop these, cultural organizations could help develop these. So this is just a tool that we can apply to different landscapes. The second tool I want to mention is like an ecological agreement. Could also call this like, some of us call these earth agreements. It's essentially like, if we were going to decide what the potential of this room was going to be, right? We could kind of envision that together. We could bring in some tools to kind of help us visualize what that is and agree that that would be amazing. I would support that, right? Oftentimes municipalities are important in this conversation, right? Municipalities may want to have clean water from the rivers that come nearby, right? They may impose regulations on factories upstream, right? Or they may incentivize certain behaviors, right? So they may put money up to kind of make this happen, right? So you can have business, government, and the general public can actually put money out there for this agreement. You have these ecological state protocols that are tied up in the ecological change and the measurement, and then they get kind of funneled to farmers that are making these changes, right? So it's very outcome-based, right? We're not talking about what practices, whereas like some of these certification bodies are saying, you must adopt this practice and this practice. And like I have a friend who's, they got biodynamic certified, but the way they do compost for biodynamic is different than, it doesn't, they have to give up their organic certification because it doesn't fit the same criteria. So it's very practice-based. So this is like strictly outcome-based, right? Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So these are two kind of fundamental tools. That's like, so, in essence, what we're talking about here is like aligning the ecological health with the economics of agriculture, right? We're increasing the sort of funding sources and the ways for people to qualify for additional funding that comes not just from the consumer, right? Because these are common interests, right? That we have this ecological health. It's not just when we come to the store. Sure, we want the price to be, we want this to be affordable, but there's other ways to kind of subsidize, essentially, the different, and recognize these different practices. So a little bit under the hood of like these two organizations that have been mentioned. Regen Network is like this sort of for-profit organization. We're currently in like an equity fundraising model, and we're working on what's something called a ledger. And I'll talk about that just in a moment. And then Regen Foundation is sort of the nonprofit focusing on ecological state protocol development, partnering with science institutions, educational institutions, and also runs what's called like a consortium. Similar to a co-op, this piece of technology in the middle here, it's essentially a data structure. It's a place to store data. Okay, when we talk about the centralized model, like you can like think about like an Excel document, right? In the beginning you had Excel, you had it on your computer, right? And you had some, all your kind of entries in there. And then kind of Google comes along, or some other, or Microsoft 365, right? And you can share this document with others, right? And whenever you make a change, it uploads it to Google servers, and it's saved over there, right? But what happens if Google decides they're going to start charging you tomorrow? Right now it's free, right? It's this centralized model where you kind of don't have control over it, right? Still, and with these centralized models, it's like a lot of times they're sort of incentivized to take advantage of that monopoly that they get over time. Like early on, it's free, and then over time, it's just their shareholders will start to kind of, hey, you got to start asking people to pay for that now, And now that everybody's there, and Excel is kind of gone, you kind of don't have a say anymore. So this idea of this blockchain is essentially like, imagine instead of Microsoft owning all those servers, that the people, just like a co-op, that the people who are part of the community would actually run the servers and run the technical infrastructure and would be actually co-own the technology, right? So the Regen Foundation is lifting kind of convening this consortium and helping to kind of establish like this network of folks who have the technical capability to be responsible for this shared commons, technology commons, essentially. And Regen Network is essentially doing the early stage development to fast track and put that out into the world. So that's sort of, yeah.
How small of a farm is this applied to?
It,
Acres, 2 acres, 8 acres, 20 acres?
so we did it.
1,000 acres?
Yeah, it can be anybody basically. So if there's an agreement, right? If there's like we did a little prototype app that you can basically zoom in on a map and kind of just mark out where your land is, and then the idea is you'd be able to see what you qualify for, right? And then some things like no-till, right? Where it's like it's very easy to validate with geospatial data and remote sensing. You can just look and see through satellite imagery, like last year there was tilling going on, and this year there's no tilling. Wow, you qualify for a no-till protocol. And Regen Foundation is currently fundraising for a no-till ecological state protocol. Once that's complete, you can start to come to, reach out to anybody who cares about no-till and start to put funds to incentivize those practices, right? And anybody can just voluntarily come and adopt.
The blockchain?
Well, the blockchain is just like the verification happens there, right? So the idea is like there'd be this like kind of earth ledger, right, that sort of has this verified data, so that if somebody came 20 years later and looked, they could say, oh yeah, there was no-till going on there 20 years ago, and then there was this lag, and now it's back again. You can have this kind of like, the idea with blockchain is that the data, once it's there, because everybody's kind of sharing the database, it doesn't go away, right? If I turn off my computer, it's still, there's somebody else who has a copy out there, kind of like the cloud. So, yeah. And that's it. So, and if it, and one more thing I wanted to say was I'm currently doing some little, so if you do have a farm, if you'd like to come and chat with me afterwards, I would love to kind of hear a little bit about your situation and because we're sort of exploring our business model a little bit on the Regen Network side, so yeah.
The communication aspect of the chain block, is that satellite dependent or is it for 5G? I mean, what is the technology for the communication aspect?
You mean where is the data stored? How is it added to this blockchain?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the blockchain, this data structure that's copied across anybody who participates, right? That's just through the internet, essentially. But with these validations happen, the ecological state protocols would have to run, an algorithm, whether it's crunching satellite data or crunching sensor data, whatever your inputs are. That's that data has to be uploaded in some fashion for that to happen, and then the results get stored on the blockchain. Does that make sense?
So satellite dependent.
Well, it depends on the protocol, right? Some are going to definitely require that somebody goes and maybe looks at the land once in a while. You might have to take a soil sample every 6 months, right? That might be a lot of methodologies, like for carbon sequestration, for example, are very dependent on somebody going out and taking soil samples in regular intervals, and it's not yet automated. But there's not to say that it couldn't be manual today, and 5 years from now, there's some little sensor that's sending data somewhere, right, and uploading automated. So they can iterate over time and get better and better and better. Does it make sense? So it could be a total manual, it could be someone with a clipboard coming through, right, and similar to sort of one of those certification bodies. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
So sensory data, oh, sorry, hold on. What was your question? Oh, the mic comes to you. Sensory data, so you were talking about, how does that upload? So it's an observation, sensory observation, you're saying?
For you mean for the satellite?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's satellite data that's free.
Okay.
And then we have, there's a company called Planet that has I think they have 200 satellites that they manage, a network of satellites. And we have, some conversations with them to sort of, work together with them. And they have like there's different resolution satellite imagery, and some is more expensive than others, and some is like kind of on demand also, like you'd have to register your area, and then the next time the satellite sort of passes, it would sample that area.
The soil types and things like that?
Well, there's a limit to how much can be verified just from satellite. I mean, it's kind of romantic to think that you could kind of validate everything from the sky, right? But some things, like species, right? Like biodiversity, like, we could get creative and put, you could start to put, like there's an organization in Thailand that I collaborate with a bit that does tiger habitat, right? And they have camera traps that they put up, right? And then they go through and they look through the footage, and that's a total manual process today, right? And so that might be, they're a trusted organization, and maybe that's how they verify that there's tigers and breeding tigers in some area, right? So that could be a protocol called like the Tiger Protocol for Eastern Thailand, which could then inspire one for India, but maybe it's slightly different in India, right? It could be a variation. We could do something similar for bees, right? You might need to record the bees coming and going, like it sounds. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Is there like a standard way to?
Where are you there?
Is there like a standard way that this data is like inputted? Like, is there like a standard for how you receive the data or what form it's in terms of like people actually inputting the data themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it depends on the protocol, right? So if it's like passive for somebody, like, and you just say it's a satellite, then we would basically build that, right? If it's something that needs to be uploaded, then maybe there's some template. But these are all things that need to be evolved. Yeah, these are all great questions. Like in technology, there's like structured data formats like JSON or XML. These are file formats. So we can start to create those for these, for no-till, not for no-till, for like pollinators or for riparian buffer zones, right? Like and this is all very informed by the science, right? And by scientific papers. So that's another thing I didn't mention here, which is, there's a lot of research that's already out there, but it's not being used, right? And so one of the kind of business models we're exploring is like, how can we take the research that people are already doing and then give attribution, right, to whoever's applying those research papers and transforming them into these ecological state protocols. That actually if a lot of farms end up using somebody's research paper, right, how do we get some kind of credit back to that person who actually did the research initially?
Thank you, Daniel.
You're welcome.
Very informative.